Hi folks, this is Jeffrey Donaldson offering what I hope will be a series of what I'd like to call jeweler's eye analyses of single poems in recently published books by Canadian poets. I've always liked the phrase jeweler's eye analyses. I've used it in a lot of my poetry class, but just that the jeweler's eye is that little monocle-like lens that a jeweler will put in his eye in order to look closely at the inside of watches and gems and so on, just to see how things work. And I always liked the idea of a similar kind of careful attention to the inner workings of a poem in all its expressive potential. So maybe I'll think of these offerings in terms of that phrase. The first poem that I've chosen is a poem by Peter Sanger, and it's included in a new volume. A part of my idea is that these little discussions might serve in the way of a review of new books of poems by Canadian poets. So yes, I've started off with a poem by Peter Sanger, which is drawn from a collection of his early poems. The book is called Fireship, Early Poems 1964 to 1991, and it's published by Gasborough Press in Nova Scotia, 2013. And it's just an extraordinary little piece called Silver Poplar. So yeah, let's start with a reading of the poem. Silver Poplar. So is, isn't is. It is a negative game, apophatic, turning to rights inside out. I'd rather watch riddles of leaves duck when the wind hits like a flock of, you know the kind, black on the back, white as they veer away. I wish you'd remember their name. So where to start? I guess it always makes sense to start with the title. Simple titles are never as simple as they might first appear to us. The first thing that is not simple about a simple title is its very simplicity. That is, this is a poem that's announcing that it's going to be about a thing, and so this is going to be a poem of definition, a poem of revelation, a poem where a thing will come clear in language. But poems that have simple titles like this are, in part, announcing that they are going to be about naming things, about the possibility of naming things. This is going to be about a silver poplar, and we'll be thinking about the relationship between the words that we have for a thing and the thing itself. What does it mean to discover the reality of a thing in the language that is put for it? That might feel like a heavy burden to toss on to a poem so simply titled, and I only do so in part because the poem itself in its opening lines seems to address this very problem of how we go about making things what they are, evoking them, describing them, allowing them to be all that they can be. So is, isn't, is. We could spend a lot of time just daydreaming about the metaphoric possibilities of a line like that. It is, after all, exactly evocative of the problems of metaphor itself. Is, isn't, is. What a metaphor does is it says that, for instance, A equals B. Northrop Frye extends our understanding of the paradox of metaphoric identification when he tells us that any metaphor A equals B is in essence telling us that A is not A, hence its paradoxical nature. And so this opening line seems to be saying something quite close to that. So is, isn't, is. And if you look carefully at the construction, you can see how there are two things being identified. There are two ises, and they are being metaphorically connected by a verb. that comes between them. The irony here, of course, and the layering, of course, being that the what comes between is also what it's joining. That is, that there are two nouns. Here the ises serve in the place of nouns, identified by a verb, is, or in this case, is not. So we face a paradox and an irony in the opening line that our capacity to name things is immediately compromised by things not being what they are. Names not being the things they name, yes, certainly that, but even that the things themselves somehow elude us, and that whatever they are, they're also sort of wriggling out of or evading our understandings of them continually. So is, isn't, is. Then a further wink at the tensions of the first sentence by then proceeding with then it is. This time, the metaphoric identification comes to us by way of the colon. We get, it is, colon, a negative game, apophatic, turning to rights inside out. Apophatic, look it up, great word, meaning negative theology, meaning the concept of approaching the divine by way of negations, a spirit of negation, a spirit of renunciation. There is the belief that a God would be so utterly other than everything that exists that one can only come to some idea of that divinity by renouncing everything that does exist. Turning to rights inside out, working in a similar way, that is the difficulties of naming work always paradoxically or by means of negation. That is, they turn things to what they should be. They turn them to rights by turning them inside out. So this beautifully ambiguous line that gives us two different binaries of right and wrong and inside and outside. We could notice how the poem breaks down into forms of attention. The first tercet is very abstract. It then turns from those abstractions to talk about its subject matter, and it does so rather tongue-in-cheek in saying that rather than talking about all of these abstractions, it would, or I would much rather watch riddles of leaves duck when the wind hits like a flock of, and we'll follow that through, but just look at how those lines are working. I'd rather watch riddles. Okay, so this is going to be a poem that does riddle. As we'll see, it's going to be a riddling poem. Peter Sanger is a wonderful poet of riddles, deeply immersed in the Anglo-Saxon riddle poem tradition. One particular book called The Third Hand is a set of riddle poems about farming tools. But here we have, actually preceding that book, an interest in the riddling quality of poetry in general. So the poetry is going to riddle in the sense that it will be elusive about the identifications that we discover in this poem, but there will also be an actual riddle in the poem that we will have to guess at something for which the poem provides us only a couple of clues. The irony being that the object itself will appear to us in the form of a riddle, so that even while the poem seems to first give us a riddle and then turn away from it in some way, gives us a puzzle and then turns away from the puzzle, it isn't actually turning away, but giving us a further embodiment of the abstraction itself. Leaves duck. Take a look at just those two words. What we see is that this is effectively the metaphor of the poem writ small, that this is going to be a poem about silver poplar leaves as a flock of birds. And so if you just take that as a binary itself, leaves duck, leaves are birds, and yet he's given it to us by way of a subject and a verb. We watch riddles of leaves duck when the wind hits like a flock. So Sanger works very beautifully that way, managing in the syntax of the line to create a metaphor that very much in the spirit of the poem erases itself or turns from itself grammatically even as it sets itself before you. And that pairing could really represent the turning of the poem itself, where the riddle of the poem, that is, that leaves blowing in a poplar tree are like a flock of birds turning in the wind. That leaves duck binary is the turning towards the content of the riddle itself. So we might want to stop for a second and think about leaves of the silver or white poplar dancing in this beautiful kind of chiaroscuro effect of light and shadow. The leaves themselves showing us both a dark and a light side of themselves as they flap around. To work the bird metaphor, there's the deliberate or explicit metaphoric axis in the poem. Watch riddles of leaves, duck when the wind hits, like a flock of, you know the kind, black on the back, white as they veer away. I love how he begins the metaphor as though he were going to be quite definite about the likeness. The leaves duck when the wind hits like a flock of, and then just as he sets off into the likeness, there's a pause or a block. That is a flock of what? What is the name for this bird? And so at the very moment when we're being offered the metaphor is delayed, and that of course becomes part of the riddling spirit of the poem, to give us a thing even while you're not giving it to us or taking it back. And then just the little playfulness as well in hits like a flock of, you know the kind. Right? It's funny when we use that phrase, hits like a flock of, pause, what am I going to say here? You know the kind. The phrase itself suggests something affirmative, a line and a gesture that is both giving us the metaphor and delaying it or riddling on it. And so we come to the core of the metaphoric identification. We're going to be looking at leaves and birds. The poplar leaves in the tree will show a dark side and a light side, and as the wind blows through the tree, the leaves will turn away and show us and move from their dark side to their white side. But just so is the poet imagining a flock of birds doing the same thing in the wind. We'd want to have something to say about the veering away of the birds themselves. Certainly very suggestive. Again, this is a poem about things turning, metaphors, tropes. Trope actually means to turn. Metaphors are about things turning into other things, turning away from themselves. And here the birds and the leaves veer away. That is a deflection, a heading off in a new direction. So as Sanger starts talking about leaves, the leaves themselves veer away into the vehicle of the metaphor. They veer away to become birds. Very beautifully done how he works with the action of the birds themselves as suggestive of what is happening to the tenor of the metaphor as they change into the thing they're being compared to. They veer away. And of course the poem about things veering away in a broader sense, escaping our attention, leaving us, eluding our desire to capture them in language. But I find the end of the poem wonderfully moving, and I think it has partly to do with that sense of things veering away from us. We use words, we use poems to try and move more nearly in touch with the things of the world, and yet as we speak them, as we find metaphors to evoke them, we discover that they also veer away from themselves in our doing so. And so the poem as a whole is then a kind of veering away of the poplar leaf veering away from us even while it comes real. But that sense of veering away, things leaving, a departure, a loss, captured so beautifully in the final enjambed line, I wish you'd remember their name. We're longing to know the name for something, and we're wishing that we knew the name. Just the explicit expression of a wish draws out the yearning of the poem to reach the thing that it's trying to describe. But you can also imagine it being kind of in the imperative, right, in exactly the way that a riddling poem would be. That is, I wish you'd remember their name. So try and guess what bird it is that I'm talking about here. So there's a kind of confidence in the line, but then also a sadness in the sense of a loss that inhabits it. We're not going to be able to remember their name, or their name isn't going to be named here, and so there's going to be a loss that abides at the heart of the poem and its conclusion. And of course, the very important notion that it is a name that we are seeking and may not find, and may not discover, may not remember. So really, how does Sanger manage it? I think it's so beautifully done, this relationship between evoking an object in its eidetic reality, this powerfully clear revelation of the leaves themselves as a flock of birds, and yet also embodying, making present, and recalling their loss in the very words that we seek to name them in. And I guess the last thing we'd want to think about in the poem is, what bird exactly are we talking about here? Well, I could offer a few guesses myself. I'm not a birder, and so might embarrass myself. We imagine, because this is a riddle poem, that there is a particular kind of bird that the poem is evoking. It would be a wonderful strategy of a poem, wouldn't it, to send you looking for the name of a thing that could actually be many different things, that the poem may be riddling in the direction of a bird that it hasn't itself finally decided upon, and that it is simply the veering towards that becomes also a veering away that the reader is invited to enter into. One other possibility that I rather like is the idea that the bird name that we're trying to remember is the one that slipped past us in the form of a verb, smack there in the middle of the poem. I'd rather watch riddles of leaves, duck. So that when the poet wishes that we would remember the name, he's asking us to remember that the bird has already passed us by. It's kind of a cool idea that the thing that we are trying to name in the poem has slipped beneath our notice in the form of a part of speech that is itself the motion-bearing agent of the poem, that is the verb itself. The bird that is meant to be a thing passes the reader by in the form of a process, a way of something happening, rather than a thing itself. So while we wish we'd remember their name, it's not the name that we're seeking. Finally, it's the verb that will send the thing through and beyond our notice when we're not looking, so to speak. So there we go. Peter Sanger's poem Silver Poplar. The book again, Fireship, Early Poems 1964 to 1991, published by Gaspereau Press in 2013.